So this is my video about my involvement in drones, and you could say it's my second business, and I'll get to why I'm a little bit unsure about what that looks like later on. Well, I thought I'll start how I got into drones, and the environment that I was in when I got involved in drones. And so I was at university in Brisbane in the 2000s, 2001, and I'm going to London, and I'm going on my own. I've booked a flight. I've got not much else organised. September the 11th happens, and my plans are a bit of in disarray because I wanted to work in the finance industry, but I'm going anyway. So off I go, fly to London, and I don't know if you've travelled when you were young, but I was broke. Like I had everything mattered, and the Australian dollar was just shocking in comparison to the British pound. I think it was 30 pence to the dollar. So, or 3 Australian dollars bought you a little bit less than a pound. So I arrive over there in London and get myself a job, a pub job. I'm in my early 20s, and I'm living in this like house that's like, it's like one really, really long warehouse looking thing like the Londoners do, like a townhouse, and it's just bang smack in the middle, and I don't live in a great area. I sort of live in one of the cheapest areas of London, right out in the outskirts, and behind our house, quite literally within metres of the fence, is a huge train line, and that's where I lived. And it had a bit of grass, which is what I loved it, because I came from Australia, and I grew up on with land and grass and things, and I had a shed and a Weber, like a barbecue, and I think I had one barbecue, and I was the second person in the house, so I was the second most recent person in the house, and I got the second best room. And what gave me the second best room was that my room had the hot water system in it, which meant that my room was a little bit warmer than everyone else's room, which really helped because it cost about £7 a day to heat our house in the dead of winter if we wanted it to be bearably warm, which no one did. And the game in winter was to be the last person home, and in summer, but mostly in winter, purely because if you're the last person home in winter, you didn't have to pay for the electricity or the hot water, because when you got home first, the sun would be down, it'd be pitch black, and you have to put £1 in the electricity meter, so the electricity would turn on, and then you'd have electricity for however long that pound lasted for. And if you wanted to be warm or have hot water, you'd have to put £1 in the gas system, and then start the gas hot water system, so that then you'd have hot water. So that was the sort of the state of our house. And when I started in drones, the second Gulf War had kicked off, and there started to be this use of drones. And I'm sitting there one night, broke, couldn't go anywhere, eating reheated spaghetti bolognese. I'm pretty sure I was eating spaghetti bolognese for lunch and dinner at this point, and watching the TV with one light on so that I could save electricity, because you'd put the pound in and then watch the electricity, the pound wind out. And I think I earned £6.50, I think, an hour at the pub. So I could work a whole hour just to heat the house. That wasn't the electricity for electricity. So watching TV, and it's freezing outside, and I just want a decent hot meal. And I think to myself, wouldn't it be sensational if I could get a pizza delivered to my house in a drone? One like a vertical takeoff and landing. And this is in 2002. I think that's when the second Gulf War was on. It was only when it was brand spanking new, it had just started, and I just, my imagination just ran away with itself. I could taste this hot pizza like warming my hands, yeah. And you know, all the lights on and the heat just pumping, and you just have it watching this drone just come down like Star Wars, you know, just landing on the back porch. And so I just started designing it right there, and then I got A4 bits of paper and I stuck them together on the back so that they could make this, you know, this huge piece of paper that sat on the coffee table in our lounge room. And just started drawing, got my ruler out and just started building this thing with these two big fans in each wing, with the wings folded down to create some kind a slight duct effect, like a flying wing. And it was thick enough and wide enough to store 3 large pizzas. So you could have 3 large pizzas in there, drop the pizza off, go to the next house, drop their pizzas off, or just deliver 3 large pizzas. I obviously wasn't thinking of the cost of getting this done at this time, but I certainly was thinking of everything else other than that. And that just started it. I was broke, I had nothing to do, I couldn't afford to do much. And I just started designing drones. And I think I did that. I came back a few years later from London, and I continued to design drones. I was just enamored. I was certain that they were going to completely change the world, and I wanted them to be accessible to everyone. I had no idea of how I would design the electronics. You know, I wasn't fully into electronics at this point in time. I had no idea how I would power it, or all those sorts of things. But everything that I did have some idea of, I worked on. You know, how would you get people to be interested in drones? Where would you, safety requirements, just the things that would have society say, yeah, let's put drones into our lives. I could see drones delivering, you know, parts to mine sites and to farms in outback Australia, medicines, you know, critical things where you just needed something fast, you were willing to pay, maybe not a premium, but you know, you were willing to pay to get flown there. And I could just see our world just being completely opened up. Drones in obviously warfare, because I'd watched it. And I got involved I ran into the paparazzi project, I think in 2007. And they'd designed a full autopilot. One that was capable of flying a fixed wing aircraft. It couldn't fly a drone, but they'd had a microprocessor, they had simulation software, and I spent a really long time working on getting this simulation software operating, and it was infuriatingly complicated. And you couldn't just go and buy one of these autopilots. You had to have nerd cred, so you had to have contributed to the project to be able to buy one of these, and I couldn't have built one. I'd bought it from a guy who obviously had SMD and PCB design skills, because I got this beautiful board, which I still have today. It's in our storage container. And I just continued to work on it for as long as I could. And then one day, I started to make a little bit of money. You know, I started to be not broke. And one day I thought, you know, what would be really, really fantastic is if, instead of this taking 2 years to get a drone started, what if it took 2 months or 2 weeks? And there wasn't many people, you know, building these drones. There was a few people involved, because it was out of a French university. I think it's where paparazzi started. But there wasn't too many people involved, and so I emailed the mailing list and said, look, I'd like to put a bunch of money and time into the wiki, the documentation, so that we could make this really easy for anyone to buy an autopilot and start to fly a drone. And the answer was crickets. Now, I probably should tell you what drone technology was back then in comparison to what it is now. So back then, the autopilot, today we use gyros and accelerometers and GPS, but back then those products were ITAR restricted. So there was like a trade against arms by the American government. So you couldn't sell those pieces of technology outside of America. And I'm not sure that you could even have gotten high quality gyros and accelerometers in small electronic packages, enough to run on these chips. They were only 8-bit chips, which really limited the amount of the quality of the mathematics you could do. And so we used thermocouples or thermopiles. It was thermopiles, and thermopiles can detect the difference between cold and hot. And so you'd put one on each end of each wing, and you'd put one facing downwards, and you put one facing upwards. So you'd have these 4 thermocouples, and I might be getting the name wrong. If I am, apologies. And it could detect the difference between the warm ground and the cold space. So the plane would fly, and the thermocouples would detect that, and the autopilot would get the plane to fly straight. And it could fly a distance, and you could actually buy GPSs. So I am corrected. It wasn't the GPS that was ITAR restricted, it was the gyros and accelerometers and the magnometers and things like that. So I never did get that to fly on an actual plane, but a few people did, and it was surprising. Some of them got wealthy quite quickly, and there was some gossip in the channels of what they were actually doing with these autopilots and the planes that they were obviously flying them in. So I sent this email out to the mailing list to say, look, can we do this? And I get no response from paparazzi, or a very lukewarm response. And then I get a call from a guy called David Ankers is his name. And he says, come and work with me. I am out to create OpenPilot. I want to create the world's first 32-bit autopilot. It's an open source one. Do you want to come work with me? And I said, yep, I'm on board. Now, to describe the difference between an 8-bit processor and a 32-bit processor, the difference in mathematical capabilities and precision is just incredible. And I think we were using an STM32F103 at that point in time. I don't think it had a floating point coprocessor in it, or floating point unit in it. So we were doing 32-bit math but it made an incredible, the speed was just phenomenal. And what had changed between paparazzi and the advent of OpenPilot was smartphones. And smartphones had completely revolutionized the drone market, because smartphones needed magnometers and accelerometers and gyros in a very small package. So now you could buy these chips and you could integrate them. And a time to be alive, because it made drones what I envisaged it could be. It made it possible. And so we helped to develop. I didn't develop the hardware or the software. I did all the testing, all the marketing. I did all that sort of stuff. So I'd test Zigbee connections, other wireless connections, different controller connections, all the configurations, everything I could possibly test, I would test. And it was really expensive to do it back then. You really couldn't buy a drone. You'd have to buy the components, put it together, and then hope you could get it to fly. And electronic speed controllers were really difficult to get hold of, that had a fast enough update rate, because they might only think, in those days they only had about 50 hertz update rate, and you really needed something at about 400 hertz, because you have the autopilot, you're running it somewhere in the region, I think at 400 hertz, and then trying to update a 50 hertz ESC, the speed, it just didn't react as fast enough. So there was a lot of that work. And then there was a lot of work in FPV, so first person view. So I'd build the drone, try to get it flying, maybe get it flying, then put the cameras on it and the video transmitters, and there was just a lot of soldering and working out different power supplies and lithium batteries and motors and propeller lengths, and it was just an incredible opportunity to test a plethora of things. And at this point in time, I'd started to make money on a different business called Red Dog Technology, and I had a 4-car garage at the back of our house, and it was almost entirely filled with drone stuff, from planes to helicopters to quadcopters to cars, to anything I could get my hands on, I bought. And fiberglassing, I just, every waking spare minute that I had, I spent on this stuff. And destroyed many, many, many thousands of dollars worth of equipment. I even flew to Portugal. So as the Open Pilot project started to expand from just a quadcopter controller to full autonomous flight, we'd have a once a year catch up in somewhere, and I flew to Portugal to do that. And I had 3 Zephyr 2 airframes and all of the electrical components, purchased them and shipped them to we leased this house in Portugal, and so I had them all shipped there. I think they're about $3,000 of components each, and then I planned to build them. I think it was about a week or 2 we spent in Portugal, and had an absolute ball of a time. And then I remember this one time we decided we were going to test the autonomous flight, so waypoint flights out and back. So my job would be and I had this ultra long range, controller stuff, so you could fly 20 kilometers away, and but right at the edge of our flight envelope, there was someone who was using some illegal, really high powered radio, and it was creating huge amounts of interference. So we'd have to make sure we didn't fly there, because once we went there, the autopilot went nuts, all the remote controls went nuts. You couldn't, we were screwed. So we know that by this point in time. I'd already crashed one drone and completely destroyed it. It had GoPros in it and all sorts of camera gear, all sorts of video transmitters, everything you could imagine. I'd spared no expense. And I then, so we're flying this thing out and we flip it into full autonomous mode, and it is flying. And we are shocked. And I'm tuning the PID loops as we go, because I've got the dials all dialed in it. It's going fantastic. And then I've lifted off my goggles so I can look, because I've got the full FPV goggles, which I'd purchased from, I think, Italy, and imported them. And when I did, my family had and a lot of my friends played jokes on me, because it was so weird to have a drone back then. Like, no one did. And so I put the goggles up so I could no longer see what was going on with the plane, because I wanted to see the telemetry coming in on the laptop, as it was coming in on a separate transmitter. And I think it would have been XB or RFD 900. It could have been the RFD 900, which is an incredible modem. And all of a sudden, the GPS resets. And no one had thought to put a Kalman filter or any kind of filter on the GPS coordinate, on the GPS. So the plane all of a sudden thinks that it's at 0, 0. So it needs to get to the other side of the planet, because the GPS is reset back to nothing. And now it's reporting its position as 0, 0, and the plane needs to get to the other place. And so it just flies directly, like it's going to fly through the earth. And I couldn't, they'd said this was happening, but you couldn't see it. So I'm trying to get the goggles on. I've got my controller swinging it around. I get these goggles on and I pull up as hard as I possibly can and get the plane stabilized, and it hits the ground and just skins the bottom of the plane off. It was like, I saved most of the gear, but the plane was mostly wrecked. So that was what it was like, back in the days of drones. It was like a race, like this incredible technological race, spending as much money as you possibly, and much time and every bit of manpower you possibly could to get these things up. And there was only a select group of people. I think there was only like 12 or 13 of us in the whole world that have flown to Portugal to work together. And I achieved what I wanted. I think I stopped in about 2014, and I'd achieved what I'd wanted to, because I'd always set out that I wanted it to be that you could buy a drone at the service station. You could just buy them off the shelf, they were accessible to anyone now. And I walked into the service station and there was a drone for sale. I think it was for $75. You could just pick up and take home. It had the controller with it, the whole lot. And at that point in time, I realized that I'd set out to achieve what I'd wanted. And that was also comes to why it wasn't a business, which is really unfortunate, because if I'd thought about it, the opportunity of drones was incredible. Like, imagine if I'd bought drone.com. I mean, I could have bought it all the way back then and sold it for $1 gazillion. And I think I was just young and naive. What didn't work about it, what had my part of that fail, was not recognizing that sometimes you are on the cusp of history, and sometimes you are right there at the right time, at the right place, and you should capitalize on that. I was just young and naive. I really wanted to be part of this, and I didn't want there to be any situation where my nerd cred was damaged by turning it into a commercial thing for me, because I probably couldn't have gotten access to some of the tools and technology if I'd decided to do that. But looking back now, I really should have done something about that. I really should have turned my passion for drones into a job, because at the end of 2014, I'd contributed a lot, but I didn't have something tangible to say, I built that. I created this thing that now adds value in the world. And I certainly considered it. Like, I've always loved explosives and those sorts of things. Things go bang, and I'd considered, what if you could put like weapons on drones? And obviously, it wasn't a big stretch. I'd started on drones, looking at using it in warfare. And obviously today with the Ukraine war, it's completely revolutionised warfare, drone technology. And looking from where I am now, if I was to look back and say, what would I have done differently knowing what I did now, I would have definitely bought domain names around that drone stuff. Back in those days, you could pretty much buy most of the domain names you could ever want. People weren't buying them to invest really that much at all. And even though there had been like the big boom in the 2000s, there still wasn't a huge focus on some of these things. And I would have actually put weapons on drones and shot them. Not because I wanted to make weapons, but because from a marketing perspective, it would have gotten views. It would have gotten people really interested in, what can you do, on remote control cars or drone cars, drone boats, drone helicopters, drone planes. What is possible? And I was involved in things like, there was a competition up in Kingaroy here. I can't remember what it's called now. I think it was the Australian Outback Challenge, or the Outback Challenge. And the job was to drop a ball or a bottle on a spot. So it was obviously some automated military development stuff back in those days, but it was hidden as a rescue mission, dropping a bottle of water to someone. So if I was to look back, that's what didn't work. That's where I made the mistakes. What worked was that I recognized even back then the importance of marketing, making things just easy. So you just walk in, for the consumer, you grab it, and they walk out and they have it. That interest to make it so that the Zigbee, wireless transmitters worked, and the exact setting you needed to set so that they worked really, really well was configured. Same with the RFD 900s, the same with your transmitters, all of the wiring, the right video transmitters. How do you make the wiring? Because you've got a lot of electronics in such a short period of time, short area, and a lot of transmitters. You've got the video transmitter, you've got the telemetry transmitter, and you've also got the remote control or the manual control. So you've got three completely separate transmitters, all transmitting quite strongly. So the wires turn into antennas. So I understood the importance of marketing and making the product accessible and appealing to anyone in the market. I just didn't realize and didn't recognize that you don't get many chances to be on the cusp of history. And if you do, you should definitely capitalize on that. And it's not about the money. It's about, looking back now, it was about saying, I built something and I got to do what I loved for a living, and I was on the cusp of human history. I got to decide it. Because in the end, the paparazzi project, the Open Pilot project folded. A lot of the things around drones folded. and there was some clear winners, but I certainly could have focused on the things that I really liked and built a business. Looking at why I didn't further, and I've looked at this over the years, it was obvious that it was difficult to make money in drones. It's become quite obvious now that the Ukraine war's happened that it's completely transformed war, and that building a company in the military space around drones would have been lucrative, but to carry that business from, say for instance, 2007 when I first started to 2020, so when the war started in the Ukraine, 2022 or whenever it is, it's a long time to run a business. So sometimes you can be on the cusp of human history, but turning that into a profitable business could take 15 or 20 years. So I didn't create a profitable business from it, but I did get to really create some incredible success. I learnt electronics from it, microcontrollers, C++, the C code, accelerometers and gyros, interface. Like, the amount of stuff that I learnt from this was incredible. And I still use that today. I've used that in every business since. And to this day, I've still not made any significant money out of drones, other than getting the nerd cred of being involved. So it wasn't really a business, and it was. And yeah, it was a super cool journey. So if something in this, this video, what I do for a living, if you've gotten this far, I'll tell you what I do for a living. I design business models. I look for, how do you do something that was extraordinary? My job with the drones was, how do you get them into people's hands? That was everything that mattered every day for me. And that's what I've done in a plethora of other businesses across many, many different industries. I do that through my business tech house. So I work all over the world designing business models, and I've done it in medical and tourism, mining, banking, crypto, software, property, hardware. There isn't really an industry that I haven't worked in. And I want to work with people who want to do awesome stuff. I want to build incredible businesses and create success, add value. So if you're interested in working with me, go to techhouse.com.au. There'll also be some links to my LinkedIn and a link to my book that I wrote on a completely different subject. It's on innovation on the human mind. But yeah, I'm the innovation guy. I love innovation. I'm going to create a lot more videos like this. I'm going to talk about every one of my businesses, talk about what worked, what didn't work, what the product was, the timing, and just share as much as I can about what I did that worked and what I didn't that didn't work, so that you could use that in your own business. So thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.